Scott Segrist again. We just in our last lecture looked at Islamism in general, defining, seeing it in relation to other um, elements of Islam, and now we're going to look at Syed Qutb, who is most important today in the West as an intellectual forerunner to jihadism. He was his work was foundational in establishing the ideology of jihadism. Um, for for jihadists themselves, he is maybe even more important as a martyr, because he had been arrested and ultimately executed um, by um, the government in Egypt, and 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 it was for writing a book called what you're one of the ones you're reading from called Signpost, or often translated Milestones, um, which included sort of the basic elements of jihadist theory. Um, he's also looked to by jihadists um, as a teacher, um, specifically studying his most important work um, in terms of his own um, collection of writings called "In the Shade of the Quran," and it is a thorough commentary on the whole uh, text of the Quran. And so jihadists typically study this carefully. The material in Signpost or Milestones, um, the radical book that got Qutb executed, was culled from. He took that from In the Shade of the Quran, but the whole book of In the Shade of the Quran has been important for jihadists, and not only for jihadists. I mean, Qutb, as the intro in your book talks about, he's had influence on Islamism more widely, including among people who would not approve of jihadism. And it's probably fair to say at the outset that Qutb would not necessarily have been in favor of the kind of methods used by the jihadists. He doesn't endorse terrorism. He didn't endorse killing women and children and that kind of thing. Um, he might have had a problem with that because that kind of thing is specifically prohibited in the Quran. Um, and jihadists find various ways around that. But um, so, even though good to keep in mind, even though Qutb was um, the most important intellectual forerunner for the ideology of jihadism, um, he doesn't uh, necessarily fit neatly into the category of jihadist action as we see it today. Quick, um, quick biographical sketch of Qutb. There's some of it in your book, but I want to highlight a few points. Some that the intro brought up, and some that it didn't. One of the things it didn't bring in is his early life. He grew up in a small town near the Suez Canal, and that was important for his intellectual development because uh, Egypt at the time was under British imperial rule, and he witnessed soldiers in the Suez Canal, sort of arrogantly treating the locals and stuff like that. Had a very negative impression of the British, and sort of an anti-imperialist um, outlook developed pretty early for him. He's in a Sunni Muslim family that was fairly devout. He as a lot of young people have um, in Islam, he memorized the Quran at a young age. I want to say he was 7 years old, very young. If you think about that, it's quite an achievement. I mean, the Quran is probably something like In English, it's something like 400 pages. So it's just, if not longer. So uh, but so he did this at a young age, um, and his commentary on the Quran later on was sort of going back to his roots in some ways. He was a top student too. He's very intelligent. Wouldn't necessarily call him a deep thinker, but he was very smart. Um, his early career uh, was not did not reflect the kind of piety that he's known for now, uh, per se. I mean, he was always a Muslim, but uh, early part of his career, he was a poet, he was a literary critic, he was an editorialist, and he was known as he was a player in the sort of among public intellectuals. He was a fairly important figure in Egypt, and he ended up working for the Ministry of Education, as your book pointed out. Um, and by that time, he was starting to suggest a more radical, relatively to what he had been saying before, a more radical Islamist program. He wasn't it wasn't nearly as radical as what we see in signposts, um, but it was increasingly. I think that your introduction used the term strident, and that would be accurate. And you noticed that they pointed out that um, the people in the ministry, or the leadership of the ministry, thought it might be a good idea to send him to America to experience Americans firsthand, thinking that that would kind of moderate his views, when because right now it was largely speculative. Um, and so he went to America for a few years, and it backfired. He came away with a very negative impression of Americans. I mean, it's you can read what he wrote about it. Uh, it's very one-sided, and probably by any reasonable perspective unfair. But it does include some things that Americans who are willing to criticize things about our country might find uh, have a ring of truth to it. Um, but generally, he came away saying America is decadent, um, as racist, and as primitive, not very refined, um, very lowbrow. And of course, he had been highbrow. He'd been a poet, literary critic, all this stuff. Um, and so contrary to expectation, it didn't have a moderating influence. It just it confirmed him. It cemented his radical tendency. Um, After he came back, for too long, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood had been founded by a guy named Al-Banna. He's in your reader, Hassan al-Banna. And Al-Banna had developed a pretty extensive organization. It was private, sort of grassroots, um, sort of focused on education, uh, building schools, public services, hospitals, etc. Um, and it was a very conservative uh, um, form of Islamism. This was developing into Islamism, as opposed to just conservative Islam fundamentalism. And it had become a player by the time Qutb joined it. After al-Banna was gone, it was no longer the leader. And Qutb became their chief publicist, and then and took a leading role in the organization. And they had enough clout that they were actually in the early stages of Nasser's revolution. Um, uh, when Nasser came to power, they were advisors to him, and I don't know if he ever meant to help carry out their program. He gave them the impression that he was on board with them and wanted to carry out their program. and he ended up not only not doing that, but um, going after the Muslim Brotherhood as uh, enemies of the state. Um, and basically, I mean, there wasn't a discovery of a planned attack by Muslim brothers. Um, I can't remember if it was on Nasser himself or on the government. When this was uncovered, he went hard after the Muslim Brotherhood, put a lot of them in jail, including Qutb. Qutb was in and out of jail 3 times, um, and Qutb's experience in prison uh, did not help moderate his views. He was tortured. Uh, he and one of the biggest turning points for him was there was an incident in the prison where some guards ended up coming in and massacring, just shooting down a bunch of Muslim brothers. And so he just kind of sealed his radicalism. And he wrote Signpost, put it together from his In the Shade of the Quran uh, uh, after that. And of course, that was, as I mentioned, that's what he was executed for. He was executed. I mean, he was. There was suspicion that he was involved in so, a violent attack of the Muslim Brothers. They didn't. I guess they didn't feel that they could convict him on that, but they ended up convicting him on the book as a sort of instigator, encourage, facilitate this kind of outlook, and perhaps you'll see that they might have had good reason to think that. So let's look at Signpost, and then we'll look at the portion of In the Shade of the Quran where Qutb talks specifically about jihad. But Signpost, again, this is the book he was executed for. The opening, notice with the opening, you have a presentation of humanity at a crisis, right? He says, humanity today is standing at the brink of an abyss. So there's an idea that the world's in crisis, and this his sort of view of it, in some respects, has a lot in common with the Western idea that that's been called the crisis of modernity, which really came to a head, or people started thinking this way about modernity in the West after World War I and World War II. I mean, the wheels totally came off, and what the hell happened. So but the crisis specifically for Qutb is a crisis of values. He thinks the world has lost a sense of higher values, and he presents the possible solutions in terms of democracy, Marxism, and Islam. And this is during the Cold War, so he reasonably suggests that the dominating forces in the world right now are democracies, represented by the U.S., and Marxism, as represented by the Soviet Union. And that was the structure of world power, right? Everybody was sort of aligning with one or the other, either from common beliefs or just fears for their security. And his point is that both have failed. Both of them essentially are godless systems. Both of them are essentially lack good moral values and values of what's really important in life, right? And so he presents Islam as the alternative, right? But notice that he treats Islam, or sort of presents it as another ideology that's better than democracy and Marxism, as opposed to like what I've described as a faith tradition. um, because in fact he thinks that most of what you see in the world that is called Islam at the time was not truly Islamic, right? So his solution to the crisis of modernity is, I think you could sum it up as an Islamic revival, term often used, Islamic revival, leading to an establishment of the original Ummah. Ummah is all these Arabic words, sometimes spelled different ways because they don't have the Latin alphabet. But the Ummah, I like the simple spelling, UMMA, um, which meant the community. That's what the Muslim community was called in the early days, the Ummah, right? And he wanted to restore the Ummah, the Muslim community, to its original form. And that original form was essentially the caliphate. Um, the term he uses is khilafah, which is the root of the term caliphate, which is translated into English here vicegerency or vice regency, someone acting in the behalf of another, right? A deputy, sometimes called, in this case, a deputy of God. So somebody is acting as God's representative to carry out His will through this community and through the governance of this community. So that's the nature of this community is that it will be governed by God's law, by Sharia, or more broadly by what Qutb calls the manhaj, Manhaz, meaning the Islamic way, as manifested in, quoting him, customs, ideas, practices, laws, statutes, values, and guidelines. In other words, the solution was establishment of an Islamic state, right? That's the way to sum it up. Qutb's specific description of the nature of this worldwide crisis is important to nail down. What he said was the world is in a state of jahiliyyah, and I'm going to use the simpler spelling again, which is in your book, Jahiliyya, jahiliyyah. And this was the word that's used in the Quran for the pagan community that was prevalent before the coming of Islam, right? And I think you could translate it as something along the lines of brutal ignorance or spiritual darkness. It has those connotations. So the world is in a state of jahiliyyah, just as the world was before the coming of Islam. But it's even worse today for various reasons. The essence of the state of jahiliyyah is its failure to people's failure to acknowledge God's sovereignty. And that's another key concept for him: sovereignty, Hakimiyya, Hakimiyya. These words are mentioned in your reading. The failure to recognize God's sovereignty over all human affairs, right? Not just over religious matters, but over political matters, economics, everything. And this jahiliyyah, this state where people are having other things as sovereign besides God, includes all of the so-called Muslim nations. He thinks they're not really Muslim in the sense that they're not really making God sovereign over all aspects of life, right? So what's the causes of this crisis? How did this happen? How do we go from the sort of golden age of the first three generations, some people put it, of Islam, when it was done right, to the reestablishment of Jahiliyyah, even in the so-called Muslim worlds. And just a quick review of his points may be useful. So first of all, he said there's been a corruption of sources, right? I mean, the truth, the ultimate source is the Quran, right? And Hadith again are just supplemental to the Quran, but in their interpretation of the Quran and the implications of the Quran and just ideas about how to live, the Muslim thought had been infiltrated by non-Islamic Jahili sources, like for example Greek philosophy, various foreign ideas, right? So corruption of the sources, and secondly, straying from the true method, as he says, the manhaj, right? The true method of studying the Quran, which he says is not the method of reading it for its beauty, its poetic language, for deriving, intellectual principles or establishing some kind of abstract theory. But the true method, the correct method of studying the Quran is to learn what to do. It's practical. You should read it for the sake of practice. Another way to put this is to read it devotionally, right? You read it to determine through your reading of the text what you should do, and get guidance for your personal life that way, right? And ultimately for establishing a way of life. People have gotten away from this, right? The Quran was not read that way by the leading intellectuals and others in Islam. So we've got to get back to the Quran, and we've got to read it in a way that is not influenced by outside sources, pagan sources, infidel sources, Jahiliyyah sources, right? So what's the way out? Qutb says, essentially, we've got to return to the doctrine of Tawhid. That's the English Tawhid, Tawhid, which is the principle of the oneness of God that you see in the Shahada. So the Shahada, the statement of faith, there is no God but God. Muhammad is his prophet, right? And the key idea here, this is important to grasp the whole Islamist, jihadist perspective. Again, Islamism is a broader category than jihadism, but the idea of that the oneness of God, that there's no God but God, He has no partners, as it's sometimes said in the Quran. This implies to the Islamist perspective that there is no sovereignty but God's. God is the only sovereignty, right? No human sovereignty is legitimate, right? There'll be human leaders, but you are not recognizing the truth about God unless you accept this principle of Tawhid, the oneness of God, which implies one sovereign, right? I mean, compare this to sort of Christian tradition. Christian tradition did take God as ultimate sovereign, of course. This was critical for establishing theories of natural law and justice, that there's a higher standard and so forth. But the Christians didn't find the idea of human authority problematic as long as it was in that structure, and there was no sort of correct biblical way of establishing a political society. You could do it maybe a number of ways. You could get people the kind of rulers that you get and the way they ruled could vary a great deal so long as that higher standard is recognized, right? This is more radical. This is saying that there is no human authority that is legitimate. Leaders must, the only legitimate way for them to rule is to apply Sharia law and to enforce it, right? Sharia law, again, as understood in a very conservative way. Um, so, um, so this is the core of the Islamic ideology, this notion of Tawheed, and this particular interpretation of the notion of Tawheed, the oneness of God. Um, and so the way he says it is, we need. He uses the term Tawheed here, which he says means replacing the jihadi, jahili, the jahili worldview with the worldview of Islam. The term for worldview there is tasawwur, Tasawwur, tasawwur. We've got the wrong view, got a jahili worldview, uh, and so therefore we're stuck in, we're immersed in the jahili. We need to replace that with another worldview, which is the view of Islam, right? Now notice this conception of Islam as a worldview, or a synonym would be ideology, is potentially problematic. It seems like traditional jihad, it seems like traditional Islam is something richer, something bigger than an ideology, um, even if this is understood to imply a certain way of life that that Qutb puts forth, right? Um, um, more on this later. So that's the first thing. The way out of Jahiliyyah, first, we've got to return to Tawheed. Second, we need to make a radical separation from Jahili life. Radical separation. Withdraw. Don't live by their ways at all, right? And he says at one point, it is not possible to negotiate with uh, the Jahili way, the Jahili leaders, and so forth. You'll have to deal with them, like, in the marketplace and so forth. But in terms of your way of life, you must separate completely. There has to be a purification of the Islamic way of life, right, from the Jahili influences. Third, you need to build a community committed to Tawheed and the proper method, manhaj, uh, as Qutb understands it, right? This is the reestablishment of the Ummah, right? And ultimately, you're going to need to overturn Jahiliyyah worldwide, not just within a particular regime, but worldwide. Because even if you overcome it in a particular regime, it will still be because of sort of globalized international relations. It will still not be able to totally practice faith as it should be practiced, right? And this worldwide Jahiliyyah, what it means is overturning the Jahili states, right? All the non-Islamic states, which for him is all of the states, including the one that consider themselves Muslim, right? Got to overthrow them all. And you can do this through two methods. I mean, one is through persuasion, which this is not given in your book, but the word for that is dawah, D-A-W-A. It's preaching, teaching. So you're supposed to make the appeal, and this is, in Qutb's mind, as opposed to later jihadists, this should be your first step. You should try to make an appeal, sending the message. But he takes it for granted that most nations will not go peacefully, will not listen to reason as he understands it. Right. Part of what he has in mind here is that historically, supposedly Muhammad and the Muslim community, before they would attack a nation would send a message to them saying, basically presenting Islam to them, giving them an opportunity to accept it. And if they accepted it, they would be welcomed in as brothers. If they didn't accept it, then it was fair game to go to war with them. And that was, and if they went to war with them, they were still supposed to not force them to convert, but they had to comply with the Muslim regime, right? Anyway, so that's he's thinking along those lines. Okay, dawah. Okay, you give them the opportunity, and maybe some will be won over, but he takes it for granted that military jihad will, be necessary in many cases, if not most. So how do we get started? Well, here's a key concept, another key concept that comes in. Qutb says there has to be a vanguard. Now, there's some pipe cutting going on in my backyard. Hopefully you can hear me over that. Maybe I'll speak up a little bit more. Qutb says there must be a vanguard. It's the same word used by Lenin when he talked about the need for a cadre of leading communists who really understood how the whole thing worked to direct the rest. Lenin thought this should happen through a party apparatus which maintained sort of absolute control, but acted on behalf, theoretically, on behalf of the proletariat. And Qutb had a similar idea. Muslims who understand the true method, right, who can recognize the signpost along the road, as he puts it, the way to reestablish true Islam, right, they take leadership. They send the message, they recruit followers and so forth. They join forces with other willing parties. And this is how it gets started. Vanguard, sort of Muslim intellectuals, if you will, understand the process. They're going to gather support, and then that's how the whole thing gets going. They're going to point out the signpost. In other words, what Qutb is doing, right? In fact, you could say that Qutb is the vanguard of the vanguard because he's directing what the vanguard needs to do, right? So much like Lenin, he sort of makes himself the self-appointed leader. A second point to note here is that Qutb assumes his reading of the Quran is simply the true reading, right? His reading is authoritative. He often says in interpreting Quranic verses in his writings that the meaning of this allows for no debate, that it is obvious, that it is self-evident, and so forth. And when I read some of them, I think, well, that isn't that obvious to me, but this is critical to him, right? We'll come back to that. So that signpost. I'm going to say a few words about In the Shade of the Quran. This again is where he's focusing on the part, where this reading focuses on the part that where much of what is put into the interpretation of jihad and signpost comes from, right? And we get a nice flavor of Qutb's idea of Islam here in your reading selection. He sees Islam as a revolutionary program, essentially. That in itself, that's what Islam is. Quote, it is a declaration of the liberation of mankind from servitude to creatures, including man's own desires. So this sounds like a Declaration of Independence, a declaration of the rights of man and citizen that the French revolutionaries put out. Islam is a declaration of the liberation of mankind. And ultimately, it's a revolt, is his term, quote, a revolt against any human situation where sovereignty, or indeed Godhead, is given to human beings. A situation that gives ultimate authority to human beings actually elevates those humans to the status of deities, usurping God's own authority, unquote. So that points to the nature of the liberation. Islam, quote, liberates all humans from the servitude of some to others so that they obey God alone. Right. That's the liberation. You're going to be a servant to someone. You're going to be under someone's sovereignty. But if you make God that someone, then you are freed from subservience to all other so-called sovereigns, right? So it's a liberation from the domination of humans over humans, and now we're simply going to be owing our allegiance to God. That's the nature of the liberation. And the revolt is against any regime that refuses to do that. And refusing to do that, they essentially make themselves gods. Again, this goes to the reading of Tawheed, the oneness of God. Only God has authority, and so human authorities are, by definition, illegitimate. And this, by the way, is why democracy is not acceptable for many of the jihadists, or for any of the jihadists, really. I mean, Islamists, okay, yes, there could be some of this, but for the jihadists, no. And that's because, basically, okay, in the conception of democracy has been that ultimate sovereignty resides in the people, popular sovereignty, right? That has not necessarily meant sovereign in the ultimate sense in terms of reality as a whole. People have believed in popular sovereignty in relation to the political system, even though they've accepted a higher law or something like that. And there's been this tricky issue of, okay, well, if the people are sovereign, if the people are made the absolute sovereign, then this suggests that whatever they decide is right, as opposed to obeying some kind of higher law. But at any rate, these, the jihadists take democracy as, in principle, a kind of opposing religion to Islam. The nature of this revolt is going to be against all Jahili systems, which again is all systems at this point. Well, how do we do it? I mean, so here in this passage, we get a little more flesh on the bones of what we were saying with dawah, or teaching, preaching, and jihad. Here, Qutb says there are two obstacles, right, to this successful revolution. One is mental, wrong beliefs and concepts, right? And that's what dawah would appeal to, this teaching, right, beliefs and concepts. The other is material, physical, and I'm quoting him here, physical in addition to political, social, economic, and racial, unquote. And the key point here is that it takes different methods to deal with those different obstacles, right? The means to overcoming the mental obstacles is, translation here is verbal argument, it's dawah, right? And the means to overcoming the material obstacles is jihad, military jihad, right? And we also see his evaluation of jihad fleshed out here. First important point is that he rejects the Western notion of defensive war, the defensive war doctrine. That was critical for Western just war theory, that a war of aggression, a war that you start, unless it's in self-defense, right? You could strike first if they're about to strike you, but to be just, war has to be defensive. And Qutb directly rejects that. Says, offensive war is actually required by Islam, unless you consider uh, these wars, these jihads that are taking place as a kind of defense of mankind against the jahili systems. You could say that, but in the traditional sense, no, that's just a defeatist attitude. That's people who have sort of let Westerners cow them um, into submission, right? Um, what about the Quran? What does the Quran say? Um, and here, Qutb talks about the 4 stages of jihad, right? So, in other words, the original Muslim community, uh, what was their rationale? How did they engage in jihad? And he looks to one of these earlier teachers, a Middle Ages thinker, um, who sums it up. And this is a quote from him, Imam Ibn Qayyim. Quote, fighting was first forbidden, then permitted, then ordered against those who fight Muslims, and finally against all believers, this is the 4th one, who associate partners with God, mainly like Christians, for example, the Trinity. So at first they were forbidden because they were a vulnerable community and it would be disastrous to fight them. Secondly, it was permitted because it was necessary for self-defense, and they were capable, of protecting themselves, defending themselves. Then it was ordered when they were prepared to take on, all comers. They were ordered to fight against those who fight against Muslims, right? But then it extended to basically everyone else, right? Because everybody who is not recognizing the sovereignty of God, as they understand it, is associating partners with God, is making something else sovereign, right? And so, and he thinks this sequence is final, in a sense. I mean, yeah, for prudential reasons, we might take some of this earlier. We might take some of the more partial approaches first, but the conclusion here of attacking everyone who doesn't submit to the true way is final. And what's behind this is a specific form of interpreting the Quran. It's an idea called abrogation. It's Abrogation. And the notion of abrogation is, what do you do when you have one passage of scripture seeming to contradict or not be easily reconcilable with another one? Right? How do you interpret that? Christians typically have interpreted that by sort of balancing them against each other. Well, if everything God said must be true, and if Scripture is God's word, and so if this seems to contradict this, they're not really contradictory. We got to find what is true in each, and in such a way that they could be synthesized. Right. Abrogation is the idea that when there appears to be a conflict, you might find that there really are conflicts. And what's going on there is not that God's contradicting himself, but in the course of progressive revelation, God has revealed something new, right? And the later revelation trumps the earlier ones. Right? The later revelation, the latest revelation, is the one that holds, right? So we compared this to thinking about the Constitution, so the Constitution says this, um, and you've applied laws according to that. But if there's a new amendment to the Constitution, then that trumps the original Constitution, at least insofar as it relates to whatever it relates to, right? So that's the notion of abrogation. All right, I'm going to, sorry about the flurry of videos here, but I'm going to stop there and give my evaluation of Qutb in a separate video. I believe I can make my videos on Khomeini and bin Laden shorter than this, but I have a lot of sort of background context that relates to all of them that I want to bring in. So I'm gonna make another video evaluating Qutb and using that to set up later stuff. Okay. All right. So I'll see you then.